good evening. It's wonderful to speak to an audience on what I think, and actually what many of my colleagues think, is a very important issue. So there are a lot of misconceptions about artificial intelligence and robotics. So if you want to help educate yourself, I would encourage you to get hold of a copy of my book. It's just out. It goes into a lot of detail about what AI is and what some of the misconceptions, what are the promises, and what are some of the risks and challenges we face. And as the title suggests, ending with the words killer robots, it spends quite a significant amount of time talking about the risks of killer robots, or as they sometimes get called more prosaically, lethal autonomous weapons. Now, when I say that, often in the media, they put up a picture of Terminator, and that's not what we're thinking about. We're thinking about much simpler technologies that will be here much, much sooner. Now, most of you will have seen pictures, video of the Predator drone flying above the skies of Iraq or Afghanistan. That's not an autonomous weapon. That's still semi-autonomous. There's still a human in the loop. There's still a soldier back in a container in Nevada who's actually doing some of the flying, and most certainly deciding whether or not to set off the rather aptly named Hellfire missile, taking out some targets on the ground. But it's a small technical challenge to replace that person by a computer. In fact, the UK's Ministry of Defence reckon that they could do it today, and I think they're entirely realistic to say that. And once we started to see developments like this, a couple of years ago, I started to become increasingly concerned about where we would end up. And as mentioned in the introduction, I helped put together an open letter calling upon the United Nations to consider a ban of lethal autonomous weapons and warning of some of the dangers. A warning that there would be an arms race, that these would be weapons of mass destruction.
Could you have the microphone a bit closer?
Yes, of course. I will hold it. I will hold it. There we go. How's that? That sounds better. Okay, so when we wrote the open letter, I said to my colleagues, well, I'll get 1,000 signatures. Seemed a nice round number, and it seemed to be something that might capture people's attention. And we got 1,000 signatures the day we released the letter, almost exactly 2 years ago. At the start of the main AI conference of the year, we had 1,000 signatures. To put that in perspective, the AI field, certainly back then, wasn't that big, measured in the thousands, not the tens of thousands, not the hundreds of thousands. So that was a significant fraction of the community came together and signed that. By the end of the first day, we had 2,000 signatures, and today it's around 20,000 signatures. It includes some well-known names, people like Elon Musk, Steve Wozniak, the co-founder of Apple, Daniel Dennett, and a bunch of other well-known names. But what was, I think, much more significant was that it included most of my colleagues, most of my senior colleagues, the people working with the technology, the people who understood perhaps best the risks. And there are many, many risks. These will be weapons that will fall into the wrong hands. They will be used easily by terrorists and rogue nations to do evil. They will be terribly destabilizing. We already live in a world that's actually quite destable. And these weapons will upset the current geopolitical balance of power. Now, previously, if you wanted to be a major power, you had to have a major economy. You had to be able to support an army and get that army to do your evil will. With these sorts of weapons, because they'll be able to act entirely on their own, you will just need one programmer and a modest side bank balance. So this will be completely destabilizing, and I don't think the world really can do with much more destability at the moment. Also, previously, if you wanted to do evil, if you wanted to do harm, you had to somehow persuade an army of people to follow your ill. And now you won't. Again, you'll just need that one programmer. They will be also terribly destabilizing because they will change the speed of war. We'll end up, you already have flash crashes on the stock market where the algorithms get into unfortunate feedbacks. Well, there no one was really harmed, and often they can just unwind the transactions, and it's a bit of egg on the face of some finance company. But when we're talking about lethal autonomous weapons, they may have started a war. They may have killed many thousands of people. There are serious consequences to the possible feedback loops. These will be operating in very difficult, uncertain environments. The battlefield always is. And so we could find that North Korea went to war with South Korea because we had one of these flash wars. Terrifying thought. And they will completely change the speed, not only the speed, but the precision with which we can fight war, and the extent that we can fight war. These were weapons that will never tire. They'll fight 24/7. They'll fight without interruption. They won't need to be fed. They won't need to rest. They won't get trauma. You'll be able to sacrifice them for any mission, whatever it happens to be. So it will be, as many people have predicted, the third revolution in warfare. The first revolution in warfare was the invention of gunpowder by the Chinese. That was a step change in how we fought war, in the speed and deadliness that we fought war. Second revolution in warfare was, of course, the invention of nuclear weapons. Again, a step change in how we fought war. We could now destroy the planet in a matter of minutes. And many people think this would be a third revolution in warfare. It would again completely change the way that we can fight war and the speed, efficiency, and accuracy with which we can kill the other side. And warfare is, if you look at the history of warfare, largely a story about how we use technology to more efficiently kill the other side. And if you look at World War I and World II, it can be explained by economists as who got the cheapest way to kill the other side. So we were very concerned about this issue and the arms race that was going to happen. I'm pleased to say that the United Nations did listen. I got invited to speak, and I've spoken several times actually, at the United Nations. I got to meet some very senior diplomats, the ambassadors running the disarmament talks. I even found myself surreally sitting in a meeting with the Under-Secretary General, the number 2 in the United Nations, ultimately in charge of all disarmament talks. And he said to me, he said that the UN rarely gets such a clear message from scientists warning them to take action in a sphere, and when they do, they felt very duty-bound to listen. So you now may ask, well, why am I still very concerned? In fact, I'm just as concerned as 2 years ago when we wrote that letter. I am pleased to say that the UN not only listened, but they've actually taken some small steps towards the idea, potentially, of having a ban. Last December, I was at the UN in Geneva, and 123 nations in the Convention on Certain Conventional Weapons. This is the main arms treaty used these days for disarmament. They decided unanimously to move from informal discussions, which is what we'd had for the last 3 years, to formal discussions with an expectation that there might be some formal outcome, like a treaty, at the end of which, and to begin those discussions this year. Unfortunately, because the UN doesn't have a couple of $100,000, that first meeting, which was going to happen on Monday, is not now going to take place. The UN changed its accountancy rules, and if a nation doesn't pay its dues, they can't hold a particular meeting, or all meetings have to pay for themselves. And sadly, a couple of nations, most significantly Brazil, if you know anyone in Brazilian diplomatic circles, you should shame them. Brazil hasn't paid its dues for several years. It's nothing, I think, particularly specific to this topic, and they owe the United Nations $200,000. And so, for want of $200,000, which seems like pocket change to me for a matter that concerns the whole planet's safety, they're not having talks now on Monday. They will, they're still saying they will have talks at the end of the year, so all is not completely lost, but it's disappointing that for want of a couple of $100,000, that those talks are not going ahead with urgency. Doubly so, since we offered to find the money for them from private philanthropy. There were plenty of tech millionaires who were willing to give us $250,000. And they turned that offer down because the UN doesn't take money from private individuals. So it's very disappointing that on Monday we won't be seeing the UN begin those talks formally. I can promise you as well on Monday you'll be reading about the topic in the Australian and most of the other newspapers and on television. We've got a little thing up our sleeves for Monday. I'm not allowed to tell you what it is, it's under embargo, but I'm sure you will be seeing it in the news. We're going to certainly try and take a bit of the news agenda up again on Monday. The other reason I'm still concerned is that I'm really disappointed with how Australia has been contributing to this debate. Now, Australia, as far as I know from its history, has actually played a very progressive role in many disarmament talks. It's been actually a leading proponent in some of the discussions around nuclear non-proliferation, certainly around chemical and biological and other types of weapons. And unfortunately, I can't say that that's the case for this weapon type. Our colleagues across the Tasman, the New Zealand diplomats, have been very helpful in these discussions, have been very forthcoming in helping push the discussions forwards over the last 3 years. Australia has not been at all, in fact, quite the opposite. It's been very supportive of the US position and very unhelpful in getting the discussions going. So I want to focus for the rest of what I've got to say about some of the technical concerns that we have, and I think Sue will probably address some of the more ethical and moral concerns. So since I've started talking about this issue in public the last couple of years, I've heard many possible objections to the idea that we should be thinking of banning this sort of technology. And I want to just go through the most popular objections that I get to hear and explain why in some cases they're interesting objections. This is not a completely black and white issue. There are arguments to be made for autonomous weapons. But if you think about the issue with a little more depth and with a little more understanding, you quickly come to the conclusion, I think, that I made and that many thousands of my colleagues have made, which is that the balance of the argument is excessively on the side of a ban and excessively against allowing autonomous weapons to be used in the battlefield. So the first objection people say is, but autonomous weapons, killer robots, they'll be far more efficient. I think that's why. First of all, I thought that's why you should ban them. But nevertheless, people say, well, I think they'll be far more efficient. And they will, in some sense, be far more efficient. They will be deadly accurate. But I'm not sure that they're going to, certainly to begin with, and the ones that are going to be fielded for the next couple of decades, are going to be more effective. In November last year, some secret papers were released out of the Pentagon, the drone papers, that looked at the effectiveness of the drone campaign, these semi-autonomous weapons that I talked about in the past, that are being used to kill combatants on the ground in places like Afghanistan and Iraq. And the analysis done in those papers showed that they were remarkably ineffective. 9 out of 10 of the people that they were killing were not the intended target. Now, I can tell you as a technologist, if I was asked to build such a weapon and take the human out of the loop, the human who's got immense situational awareness and ability to see what's happening through the fog of war, on a changing battlefield, we've still got a human making those final life or death decisions, don't forget. Now, if you ask me to take the human out and get a computer to start making those decisions, I can tell you my aspirational goal would be to make 9 out of 10 mistakes. We would be making far more mistakes than 9 out of 10. We would think we've succeeded when we got down to the human error. So the second objection that people often give is that, well, we can just have robots fight robots. Which, again, hopelessly naive, that one, right? There's not a special part of the battlefield, a world called the battlefield, sign battlefield. Battles over here, please, just for robots. Yeah. Battles are fought in towns and cities. They're increasingly waged amongst civilian populations. Ever since the First and Second World War, they've been increasingly turned into into wars of terror on civilians. And we're not fighting people who are going to sign up to any rules like that. I mean, if we could get people to sign up to the rules, we wouldn't even need any sort of weapons. We could just say, we'll decide the outcome by a game of tiddlywinks. That's not how it's fought. And especially so when our opponents in the sort of asymmetric world we live in are people like ISIS and terrorist organizations who will not sign up for any sorts of rules like that. So the third argument, I think this is the most interesting argument, the most challenging argument, is that killer robots will be more ethical. Ethical. They'll behave more appropriately. They'll be able to, because they're computers, they'll have to be given precise instructions how to behave. Like, computers are very precise, and that they will follow international humanitarian law. And that war, as it's currently fought, is very unethical. There's immense atrocities committed during the course of a war. Soldiers get very frightened, and not surprisingly, they kill all the wrong people. And terrible horrors do. War is a terrible, horrific thing. And that, well, if we could only get robots to fight it, we'd give them precise instructions, and then all that horror would stop. So there's a certain interesting aspect and truth to that argument, but there's also lots of things that are wrong with it. The first thing that's wrong with it is that we don't know how to build ethical robots. We don't know how to build robots that can fight according to international humanitarian law, that will identify combatants against civilians, that will act proportionally. We don't know how to do that. In, 20, 30, 40, 50 years, we'll probably work out how to do that if we wanted. But the sorts of weapons that the military will field today or in the next couple of years will not be able to do that. The second reason why that argument is wrong is that every computer program that we've ever written can be hacked, can be made to do undesirable things. And these programs, whatever ethical safeguards we will put in, will be hacked by people with evil intent who won't care that they'll be killing the wrong people. The third objection is one of our humanity and our own ethics, which is we shouldn't be giving over the decision to make life or death decisions on people's lives to a machine without the sorts of compassion and morality that we have. Another objection, a common objection that people put up is that, well, it's too late. We already have autonomous weapons. Now, there's a couple of things wrong with that objection. First of all, well, in some sense, it's true, we do have some potentially autonomous weapons. If you go to the demilitarized zone between North and South Korea, Samsung have a Sentry robot, autonomously guided machine gun that will kill anyone who steps into the DMZ between North and South Korea from up to 4 kilometers away with deadly accuracy. That's protecting South Korea from North Korea. There's no good reason, of course, for you to step into the DMZ. It's the most heavily mined part of the world. So it's probably doing a good job, and I think most of my colleagues, and certainly I, don't really have too much objections, but it's interesting that those nice people who bring you mobile phones, Samsung, also sell one of the first autonomous weapons in the world. But it's got a very limited extent. It's certainly not, as I said, there's no good reason to be in the DMZ. If the mines haven't killed you, then this thing will, and it's doing potentially a very defensive task, of a very constrained envelope of operations. I don't think it's particularly, in this case, destabilizing the world, but in other places it might be. And there are other examples. Even the Australian Navy has what might be described as an autonomous weapon. The Phalanx anti-missile system that sits on a number of Royal Australian Navy ships will protect the ship against incoming supersonic missiles. Now, because the missiles are supersonic, you don't have time to decide whether to shoot the missile down. So it has to be, by its very role, be an entirely autonomous system. You have milliseconds to respond as the missile comes over the horizon and is looking to destroy you or your fellow ships. So again, that's less something to be concerned about. It's a defensive weapon system. It has a very constrained window of operations. It just protects the airspace above the ship. And it works only on supersonic radar traces. So you're unlikely to be a supersonic radar trace, or even the civilian aircraft that you might be flying in is not going to be easily recognized as a supersonic missile. So I'm not, again, unduly concerned about such a weapon. I'm much more concerned about weapons that have much less well-defined scopes of operations that might be loitering over the battlefield for days at a time, and they have to make their own judgment as to whether that convoy of vehicles is a convoy of ambulances or a convoy of terrorists. And they certainly can't do that today. And then the second problem with the objection, that we already have them, is that that's no objection to banning autonomous weapons. There are many weapons that we've banned that we already had. We had chemical weapons when we banned them. We had biological weapons when we banned them. We have still nuclear weapons when they were recently banned. We had most of the weapon types that have been successfully banned when the weapon treaty came into force. And the final common objection here is, well, yes, Toby, it's all very well and good, very idealistic, but weapon treaties don't work. Well, again, history would suggest the opposite. Weapon treaties do work. I think the world, and many people would agree, is a much safer place because of weapon treaties. Yes, it's true that chemical weapons occasionally get used in Syria and elsewhere, but I would imagine they would be much more widely used if there wasn't moral repugnance against their use, if there wasn't universal condemnation when they do get used. If they do get used, they're instantly, they're front pages of the New York Times and leading newspapers. They're in the news, there's resolutions put on the floor of the UN, and there is, of course, a distant threat of a court in The Hague for whoever is responsible. And that seems to be enough. That's actually, in many ways, how the UN actually enforces itself, is by these rather subtle ways. There's no police force that's monitoring this. In fact, for most of the weapon treaties, there's no formal organization responsible for doing the monitoring. And there's certainly no formal organization, no standing army there to go in and sort out anyone committing it. It's done largely by the moral pressure, the repugnance that humanity has for this weapon. And that's, I think, how it would work here. That if we could decide as a society, as we occasionally do, that this was a weapon that we didn't really need, that there are plenty of good things for AI. I'm a professor of AI and I work in the field because I can see immense benefit. It can transform our education system. It can transform our healthcare. It can transform and improve the prosperity of our economics. There are immense benefits that can come, but it's a technology that is morally neutral. It can also be used for immense bad. And it's really up to us as a society to make those right choices. And we could make the choice that we don't need to industrialize war. We don't need this technology, just like we have made that decision about many other weapon types, and actually made the planet a slightly safer place as a consequence. So, as I said, keep an eye out on the news next Monday. You'll be hearing some more about this topic, and it will be back in the news agenda, I very much hope. And if you want to find out more, I encourage you to pick up a copy of my book. It's available in all leading bookstores, and you can, if you're a Kindle reader, there's an e-book version available as well. It goes into a lot more detail about these sorts of arguments. And if you want to know more about AI in general, not too much about this topic, but about what are some of the other challenges and promises of AI, I was involved with an ABC documentary, which is still available on iView, called The AI Race. So you might want to take a look at that. Thank you very much.